Hey guys, today I'm going to be telling you guys all about screaming and screamo.
What's up everybody, I'm Finn McKenty, this is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about screaming. Because when I was a kid growing up listening to Suicidal Tendencies and Black Flag and whatever, the one thing I never ever thought I would hear on the radio is screaming. I could see how they could commercialize pop punk or grunge or gangster rap, but screaming? No way, never, impossible. But if you are watching this, then you know how wrong I was. Because only a few years after I said that, they did it. By the early 2000s, screaming was all over MTV and rock radio. Bands like The Used and Linkin Park were selling millions of records, and somehow this had become mainstream. So how did that happen? That is the question that I'm gonna answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, I would love it if you would subscribe and also turn on notifications, because I keep hearing from a lot of people that they're not getting notifications about my videos, and it really helps a lot. Also, I started a weekly newsletter. If you're interested in that, I just send out an email every week with links to whatever content I put out, no spam or ads or anything like that. There's a link to that in the description, and with that out of the way, let's get into it. So first of all, let me kind of set the stage with a little bit of context from roughly like the 1950s up until the 1980s. This video is not an attempt at being like the comprehensive history of screaming or anything like that. So I'm not going to go into every instance of screaming or semi-screaming that happened over the years. But I do think it's worth noting that it had been kind of hanging out in the background or in the corners of popular music for a long time. The main example of that would probably be the early rock and roll artists like Little Richard or Howlin Wolf or the Beatles. And then in the 70s and 80s, punk and hardcore came along and took that to a whole other level. Although I think those bands weren't really screaming as a deliberate musical device in the same way as like Little Richard would. It was more just like, we want to make the most obnoxious, abrasive shit ever, like anti-music, so I'm just gonna scream into this mic so that everyone will want to cover their ears and leave. Which I can respect. And what you'll see, I think, in the rest of this video is that there's always been kind of two parallel tracks of screaming. Starting from the very beginning, back when the metal and proto-metal bands were kind of doing their thing to pioneer screaming. For example, the falsetto kind of vocals of like Judas Priest. And the thrash bands, for example, and of course all the grindcore, death metal, and black metal bands who were pioneering like the really extreme harsh vocals. But all of that being said, there really wasn't anybody screaming in the way that we think of it now. Lots of people were kind of hinting at it and laying the foundation for it, but nobody had done it yet. But that was about to change. Which brings us to part two, the 90s, screaming. There was also the alternative metal bands that weren't as gigantic as the grunge bands, but were still pretty big, and pushed the limits vocally even more than the grunge bands did. For example, like Faith No More, Rollins Band, and Helmet all got a lot of airplay on MTV and alternative rock radio with screaming-ish vocals. For example, I don't shoot you, just give it a smile. Or and on the metal side of things, in 1994, Pantera went to #1 on Billboard with an album that had this on it. And a big development here, I think, was Fear Factory, who back in 1992 on Soul of a New Machine was probably the first example of the good cop, bad cop thing as we think of it now. The other big development of kind of the mid-90s was the early nu metal scene, especially the Deftones, who I think really coined that particular flavor of the more moody, good cop, bad cop thing. Limp Bizkit broke through with Faith, which was full of screaming. And there's lots more examples. Like I said, I can't list everything, but that was kind of what was happening in broad strokes. But I would point to two really key developments in this era, where the two most important types of screaming were pioneered that really like formalized the two different branches of screaming. The first big thing was happening in the West Coast hardcore scene, specifically like in San Diego and Northern California. If you think of it as like the metal branch and the emo branch, this is when the emo branch was really created, the same style that bands like The Used and Underoath and Hawthorne Heights would go on to popularize in the 2000s was created. And if I had to point to one record by one band that was responsible for that, but unfortunately gets almost no credit for it. It would be the self-titled 7-inch by a band called Heroin from 1992. Very ahead of its time. 1992. I hear a lot of people now talking about bands like Orchid or Saetia or Page 99 as being like OG screamo. And those bands are awesome. I think the people in those bands are super cool and they deserve a lot of credit. But as I'm sure they would tell you, they were not the creators of it. They were the second generation of that sound. The actual creators of that style were from the early 90s on labels like Ebullition and especially Gravity. Bands like Angel Hair, Antioch Arrow, Guyver One, Mohinder, John Henry West, Iconoclast, Portraits of Past. They were all happening kind of adjacent to like the hardcore scene. This scene was kind of pretentious. Wait, who am I kidding? It was very pretentious. They would set up on the floor. They all had like the Beatles Spock haircut, wearing thrift store sweaters. And as soon as the first song started, they'd throw themselves on the floor, freak out and scream like a kid who was expecting to get Nintendo 64 for Christmas but didn't. So it was kind of funny, but in all seriousness, this stuff was a huge part of the 90s hardcore scene that you really don't hear people talk about much. And the second big thing happened in 2000. Arguably the most important thing in the history of screaming, Linkin Park's first album, Hybrid Theory. Chester didn't exactly scream in like the fall down on the floor, screaming like somebody just cut off your hand kind of way like I just talked about, but it also wasn't super far off from that either. It was pretty intense. And yet somehow it was also really catchy. Him and Linkin Park, I think, were the first people to come along and make screaming into something that was actually pretty accessible. And I think this is the album that made screaming part of the musical vocabulary for mainstream rock bands. And if Heroin and the Gravity bands were the template for the emo branch of the screaming family tree, then I would say that this album is the template for the rock branch of it. Which brings us to the next era, the golden age of screaming, the 2000s.
Okay, so screaming is mostly found in subgenres like heavy metal, deathcore, screamo, emo music, and it's getting pretty famous.
The first and biggest development here is what I like to call the mall screamo scene. All those bands like The Used, Underoath from first to last. This is really where you started to hear that emo style of screaming, but on a mainstream stage. Those bands took what Heroin and Antioch Arrow did, repackaged it, and got it on the radio. And all the other bands that make you think of some angsty 16-year-old wearing those like stripy fingerless gloves, pouting in their room, writing live journal blogs. I would say Thursday is probably the beginning of this era. They were a legit post-hardcore band from like the New Jersey DIY scene that somehow ended up getting on a major label and going to number 7 on Billboard. Still kind of blows my mind that that happened. But when I think of the quintessential mall screamo band, it's definitely The Used, who were shockingly popular. I think they have like 3 Billboard top 10 albums, went multi-platinum, and at least on their early stuff, they did pretty much have that fall down on the floor and shriek like somebody cut your arm off style of screaming that I talked about with the 90s Gravity bands. And just like Linkin Park, they somehow managed to make this like incredibly harsh, extreme style of screaming palatable and accessible to a mainstream audience. I remember hearing this band back in 2002 or whatever when they came out and thinking like, wow, they did it. Somebody found a way to commercialize Gravity Records style screamo. And of course, all the other bands like Finch, Census Fail from first to last, Underoath, and Saetia, as well as many, many others. I can't possibly list all of them, but collectively that cohort of bands sold millions and millions and millions of albums and introduced a whole generation of kids to the idea of screaming. And importantly, because this stuff was really popular, those kids never had the same assumptions that I did as far as any kind of like inherent commercial limitations on music with screaming. Like when I was 15 and Green Day and The Offspring were blowing up, and I was thinking, okay, but nobody's ever gonna make hardcore popular like this. And make no mistake about it, these may have been radio bands, but a lot of them did have roots in the real hardcore scene. Most notably AFI and Census Fail, I think, but they weren't the only ones. And the big contribution here to me is the idea of vocals as an instrument, rather than singing per se. You couldn't understand what they were screaming unless you read the lyrics, but that's okay, you didn't need to. What you needed to understand was how they felt. And that kind of screaming added a whole new emotion to popular music, I think. One that had never really been represented before, that kind of like dramatic emo angst. And going back to the idea of these like parallel tracks, the other big thing happening at that time was what I call the metalcore 1.0 scene, taking the more metal style of screaming also to a new level of mainstream success. Killswitch Engage, As I Lay Dying, and the defining element of this stuff, vocally, I think was the good cop, bad cop formula. Meaning like going from screaming to singing and back. But if you think about it, it was kind of picking up where bands like Fear Factory and then VOD and Poison the Well left off, who were very early, and when they did it, it felt like shockingly different and new and almost a little bit strange. Like they were doing something wrong. All right, come on guys. You can either sing or you can scream. You can't do both. You gotta pick one. And at first, I kind of felt the same way about those early metalcore bands. And I think a lot of other people did too, just because that was such a new idea. But within a couple years, we all kind of got used to it. And by now, it just seems totally normal. And so I think they really added that to like the musical vocabulary of metal. And then a couple years later, we got the Rise Records flavor of metalcore, the Devil Wears Prada, Attack Attack, Asking Alexandria, Of Mice and Men, all those bands, which to me were kind of like a combination of everything that I talked about earlier in this video, just kind of rearranged and remixed. Again, the good cop, bad cop vocals were a really big part of this style, but I think the Rise core bands had a little bit of a different take on it than the Killswitch and As I Lay Dying kind of branch. Their harsh vocals were a little bit closer to like the mall screamo style of screaming than the metal style of a band like As I Lay Dying. And their clean vocals were more along the lines of, I don't know, maybe like Get Up Kids or something, as opposed to like Dio that Killswitch was drawing from. And I've always loved metal, but as somebody that really comes from more of the punk and hardcore side of things, that resonated with me a little bit more. This is also around the time that the idea of screaming as a legitimate technique started to be a thing, which is very interesting to see because to me as a kid growing up in hardcore, there was just screaming. Like there wasn't any kind of technique to it. You just pick up the mic and scream into it as loud as you possibly can. End of story. But thanks to people like Melissa Cross, who was one of the first vocal coaches to specialize in metal vocals and screaming, it started to become a legitimate set of techniques, just like any other kind of singing. There's all these different ones like fry screams and false chord screams. I can't keep them all straight. Kind of reminds me of like Eddie Bravo's 10th Planet names for stuff. Bro, you gotta go from the spaghetti monster to the bubblegum cookie and set them up for the brain fart.
You got fried screams, you got death growls, high squawks, you know.
And so as that library of techniques started to build, this is when you started to see all those like how to scream tutorials pop up on YouTube. Some of which were great, a lot of which were maybe not so good. This is also around the time when MySpace deathcore started to pop off and scene kids discovered the world of harsh vocals. I'm not sure why, but they seem to especially love the pig squeal, probably because of Job for a Cowboy. My personal favorite controversy of the late 2000s was when someone who did deathcore type vocals would get accused of inhaling. The ultimate insult.
Inhaling is for little scene pussies who have no talent whatsoever.
There is no bigger assault on someone's honor than jumping in the YouTube comments of someone's deathcore video and saying, LMAO, he's totally doing inhales. I don't know if anybody ever got into like an actual fist fight over being accused of inhales. Cupping the mic was another very contentious topic. Yeah, well, let's see you do it without cupping the mic, you gay little scene kid. And one more really interesting development in kind of the mainstreaming of screaming and harsh vocals was easycore, a subgenre that started popping up in the late 2000s, which is essentially pop punk with metalcore breakdowns and vocals. And to me, that was like maybe the most unlikely, unexpected place that screaming ever appeared. I mean, who would have ever thought that pop punk and like screaming over breakdowns tuned to drop C would be a thing? But it was, and it was pretty cool. Easily one of my favorite weird little trends of that era. And if the larger heading and overall theme to this video is about making screaming accessible, then this might be the ultimate example. These bands somehow made death metal growling seem happy and fun. And if you step back and think about it, that was a huge amount of innovation and progression within screaming in really only about like 10 years. It went from being something that you kind of sort of heard here and there on a few albums in mostly obscure genres to something that was all over the place, front and center, on albums that were hitting the Billboard Top 10. But of course, that couldn't last forever. The pace of innovation did slow down a bit, but it didn't stop. And that brings us to the final part of this video, the last era, the 2010s to the present. We haven't seen a ton of totally new things since the Cambrian explosion of screaming in the 2000s, but there have been a few. The big one, which I personally kind of hate but has totally taken over this era of metalcore, is the pitched screaming thing as popularized by Ollie Sykes of Bring Me the Horizon or Sam from Architects. Now the which to me is kind of like bringing together the two branches of the screaming family tree, because it's like bringing a screamo edge to that Linkin Park style. And of course, Sam from Architects, blah, which has been completely run into the ground and copied so much that the poor guy hates it now. And also I think that Frankie from Amir and Franz from Attila took the craft of screaming and harsh vocals to a whole new level creatively. You can think what you want about their music, you don't have to like it, but both of these guys really innovated on it by adding a huge range of variation to screaming that I don't think really anybody had before, in terms of like pitch and rhythm and flow. For example, and I think the common thread there is that both of those guys are very influenced by rap. And speaking of which, probably the biggest development in screaming of this era, which also brought a lot of innovation to rap, is the introduction of screaming. There's artists like Scarlord or Ghostemane or City Morgue that use a lot of very aggressive screaming in their music. They call this stuff trap metal. And at first, I think people kind of didn't really know what to make of it, didn't like it, but over the past couple years, I've seen things kind of turn around, and those artists are bringing a lot of hardcore and metal kids into like the alternative rap scene, which is cool to see. And so it's kind of come full circle, with rap influencing metalcore bands, which then in turn influenced the new generation of rap. And so that brings us to today. Again, we've kind of come full circle. These days, you won't find many artists using screaming in the mainstream like you did in the 2000s, but that doesn't mean that screaming has gone away. In fact, I would say it's the opposite. Screaming has now been added to the musical vocabulary of all kinds of different genres. Everything from pop punk to rap. And as somebody who's always in favor of musical innovation and pushing the boundaries, I think that's pretty cool.
Screaming may sound easy, it's not just yelling, it's not all fun and games.
All right, my friends, that does it for this video about the evolution of screaming. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Like I said, a lot of people have told me that they're not getting notifications for my videos, and it really helps when you have those on. And also, if you want to get my newsletter, you can do that at the link in the description. I'm sending out an email every week with links to any videos or podcasts or interviews or other content that I put out. No spam, no ads, nothing like that. I'll never share or sell your email. So if you want to sign up, you can do that at the link in the description. And also, as always, I want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon. It is because of your support that we're able to do a lot of stuff, most notably the podcast. So I'm sincerely grateful to everybody who is generous enough to be a patron. I really, really do appreciate it. Patrons get every podcast a week early. There's a members only private Discord server that I'm on all the time. There's a chance to have me review your work, whether that is your music, a video, your design or photography portfolio, an app. So if you want to support us on Patreon, you can do that at the link in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.